thanks all for joining. Great to have you all here tonight. So I'm really excited. Once again, we're covering how COVID's impacting everything. We've got law school admissions in the time of COVID-19. We've got here Christine Carr, former Associate Director of Admissions at Boston University School of Law, now private admission consultant at accepted.com. How you doing, Christine? Thanks for joining.
Doing great. No, happy to be here. Thanks.
No, thanks so much for joining. Really excited to have you on because I get so many questions these days about how COVID is impacting law school admissions in terms of timing, in terms of what to write about, in terms of how competitive this upcoming cycle will be and the one after that. And so I'd love to have you share your thoughts. I know you put together a great presentation for everyone, so I'm excited to have you on. And of course, folks, as always, there's a chat function here in Zoom, so feel free to pepper Christine with questions throughout and she'll address them for you. So Christine, I'll turn it over to you and let you do your thing.
Okay, super. Thanks so much, Steve. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight, and hopefully I'll be a resource for everyone. And as that resource, I want you to feel free throughout the webinar to shoot me a chat question, and I'll try and field them as we go. So welcome everybody. Good to see you all here, and glad to hopefully share some insight with you. So as Steve said, I previously worked at Boston University. I've been there for 9 years. I left in 2018, and that was to pursue another career direction. But I feel like I always have the applicants at heart, and so have been working as a private consultant with Accepted for the last couple of years to guide applicants and clients through the process, and again, hopefully utilize some of my insight. So let's talk about, we can talk about law school admissions in general, and I can field those questions, but then let's also talk about them in the environment that we're currently experiencing and living through together. So law school admissions during a pandemic. I wish there were a rule book or a workbook that we could all, guide from, but there's going to be some constants as far as things that have happened, all along are going to continue to happen. And so what's not going to change is you're still going to need to, submit your transcript, and your GPA is going to be looked at. Primarily your undergrad, because everybody will be coming in with an undergraduate GPA, but those of you that have a master's or graduate degree, that will also be looked at. So those transcripts are also important. The LSAT and the GRE, so standardized test, is important and continues to be important. So I can answer some questions, LSAT, GRE, if people have those as well. You likely are going to have to submit a resume. You're likely going to have to submit at least one, if not more, letters of recommendation. And then, of course, your personal statement, which is, in my view, a really personal, important way to make your application personal and make your application three-dimensional. I can tell you, when I sat on the BU admissions committee, with every application I read the personal statement first. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to make the applicant a human being and get an understanding of why they were going to law school and why now. I'm getting a question from Caleb. Thanks. The admissions place high value on letters of reference. If the original referee has been affected by COVID-19, if so, where do we explain this? Yeah. So if I understand the question, you're saying that the recommender and the referral was affected by the pandemic. And so how do you explain that? So if you are unable to source out other letters of recommendation, I would first go to other sources and find some other sources that can write you a strong letter. If there is, an outstanding position, contact admissions office directly and find out from the admissions office and how that can be handled. There's great admission staffs all over the country, and they are, happy to field questions. And that's actually going to be one of the pieces I'll discuss in a little bit about, how you can be a discerning consumer in the time of COVID. And that's how admissions office respond to you. But again, I would reach out to the admissions office directly and ask them how to handle that, and whether or not you can, still reach out to that referral, or have that referral talk about how, the COVID and how the pandemic affected, and they can maybe speak to what your character was like during that tumult, during that time of change. So, I'm not, Caleb, you can let me know if I answer that as well, or if there's more, please feel free to continue to chat questions about that. So what's going to be different for you all in this time? Caleb brings up a good question about the letters of recommendation, and that, people are going to be affected in different ways. But one of the other pieces that came to my mind that's going to be effective is resumes, right? So I'm sure people's internships, summer internships were changed. I'm sure there might have been people affected by layoffs or, being furloughed, and having a gap in your resume. And of course, admissions committees are going to be understanding of that, and they're going to know that. One of the things at BU that when we were reviewing resumes, we could not accept a gap that was longer than a month. All right, anything longer than a month, we expected an explanation. So there are going to be gaps on many people's resumes that are going to be longer than a month, right? They're going to be pandemic-related gaps. And so, chalking it up to the pandemic, as long as you're acknowledging it and saying, this, internship ended, or for those internships that never even started, if say you're a 2020 graduate, you graduated in May, congratulations. You had an internship that was supposed to start up June 1st. The pandemic happened, the internship never came to fruition. And then, you were home like the rest of us watching Netflix and, and hanging out. And there's no shame in the Netflix game. We've all done it. But there's got to be some explanation and some kind of, this is why June and July there's no employment, but this is how I spent my time. And whether that's studying for the LSAT, whether that is caring for relatives, or, working on a political campaign, or taking part in some other activism that's happening. Alyssa's asking, where does that explanation go? You can do it right on the resume. So this is not a job application. You can, submit that, you submit your resume, and it's more of a CV than it is an actual kind of business resume. So you can describe things in different ways that aren't just that kind of one-page business resume. You can also think about doing a resume addendum. And in that addendum, talk about, say, on my resume, there's a gap from, June and July of 2020, due to the pandemic. My internship at, facility X, law firm X, hospital Y, et cetera, was no longer available to me, but this is how I spent my time. And Caleb is talking about how we use the gap as studying for the LSAT. So it's fine to talk about studying for the LSAT and say, this month or 2 months was dedicated to compiling the strongest law school application possible, which included studying for the LSAT, which is self-study, and detail your schedule a little bit, but then also say, and on top of studying for the LSAT, this is also what I did. Whether it is, working on a campaign, spending time with family, trying to stay sane. And, that's not necessarily something that you want to kind of put on that, but just, think about the things that you did that were somewhat constructive, and talk about those as you're describing the gap. Again, in regular, normal times, many an admissions committee is going to push back on applicants that had gaps in their resume and reach out to them and say, in review of your application, we noticed a gap from June 2018 to September 2018. And like Caleb is saying, many a times we were told that was time spent, I left my position at law firm X so that I could spend time studying for the LSAT and preparing my law applications. I would often then email that applicant and say, that's great. Can you please tell me how else you spent your time? What else were you doing? Because again, that's going to round out the application and give a more three-dimensional picture of the applicant. The other piece of what an admissions committee is looking for when they're reviewing applications is they're looking at the human being that's associated with the application and how they are going to be members of the community and how well they are going to adjust to law school life. And that means having a balance. That people talk about work-life balance. There's law school life balance as well. Your first year of law school is going to be tough. You are going to hear that, and it is true. What admissions committees are trying to discern is how well you do and how well you balance your life currently so that you can take some of those tools with you in your first year of law school and be successful. So again, when admissions committees are reviewing applicants and reviewing applications, they're looking to set people up for success. And so as much as the LSAT and those test scores are, the dread of many an applicant, there's statistical significance that an LSAT score correlates to success in your first year of law school. It's not a one-to-one correlation, so it's not the be-all and end-all. But that said, there is that correlation, and so that's why it's a tool that's used and to predict success. And so we want to set applicants up for success, and in doing that, we're looking at that balance. And so, Caleb, great questions. What does balance look like in a personal statement or resume? And that's, again, that's what I'm talking about. That's the more contextual pieces. What does it look like in a resume? It is in the hobbies, interests, the volunteerism, the clubs and organizations. That piece is where we would find balance, and we would look for balance. And so, I accepted now, when I'm working with clients and I'm looking at resumes, I focus a lot on that section because that would be a section that we would focus on our admissions committee. So we would look at all of the, the jobs and the internships and the roles that you played, but then we'd also look on how you spent your time outside of school, outside of work. Where were you burning off steam? Where were you finding that balance? So that's the easy part on the resume. In the personal statement, we're not necessarily, kind of culling out balance per se in the personal statement. The personal statement should be the narrative that's talking more about why you're going to law school, and why now, why at this point in time you're looking to go to law school. So it's more, I would focus more on that balance in the resume piece than necessarily in the personal statement piece. That's not to say that it won't come across in a well-crafted personal statement, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the focus. Alyssa is asking a question. Freelance artist and have always supplemented income with retail work, call center work, housekeeping. Does that make me seem flaky? Oh goodness, no. And though I cannot keep a job for a long time, absolutely not. No. So in your case, Alyssa, I would talk perhaps about making sure, again, that you're keeping track of the time, and making sure that everything is accounted for, but then perhaps doing a resume addendum and just say that, my primary career goals were being a freelance artist, but that meant supporting that income with other means of income. And that's clear. But that's a great question because it isn't necessarily flaky. And, admissions committees, and, I sat on one, so I'm going to toot my own horn here. they're bright people, and and they will always err on the on the side of the applicant, but you never want to have them ask the question why and not have it answered in your voice. So Alyssa, this is a great instance where you might have someone ask the question, oh, I wonder why she had all of these jobs that might be more short term, and there's quite a few part-time jobs. I wonder why. They likely will know is because you were an artist and we're likely trying to support that income. But it's also helpful to have it answered in your words in a very clear and concise way. And that's, it's certainly not flaky. And again, I think this is also a good point to even add in that, our admissions committee is looking for specific jobs. If I don't have legal experience, if I wasn't a paralegal, does that put me at a disadvantage? No. So when I was at BU, we had applicants and successful applicants that were admitted and enrolled that were flight attendants, that were firefighters, that were police officers, that were wait staff, bartenders, landscapers, that were paralegals, that were legal interns, that were directly from undergraduate, that were 5, 10 years out of undergraduate. So there's no secret formula to what your resume should look like. But what we are looking for is we're looking at, you were hired, you spent your time, you perhaps held leadership positions, but it's not essential, again, depending upon where you are in your life. And so as a question, can your resume be over a page long? Yes. It shouldn't be, 3 pages, but it can be over a page, it can be 2 pages, it can be detailed. Okay. I don't think you would need the question, I chose to work abroad for 5 years, would I need to write an addendum to explain that decision? I don't think so. I don't think that would necessarily, need to be explained. I think, I think a job opportunity, regardless of where it is understandable to take. So I don't know, unless you feel compelled, unless that's part of your narrative in going to law school, then I don't think you need to worry about being compelled. Any addenda that you write should be short and sweet. So an addendum about your GPA, I say any addendum that's longer than a paragraph is too long. So it is, acknowledge wherever you feel the deficiency is, get to the point, talk about it. Does not need to be too detailed. You do not need to divulge personal information unless you feel it's pertinent. And then, then period, end of sentence, end of paragraph. So, an addenda, any addenda that you write should be short and sweet in that. Okay. So if you just, Caleb, you just graduated in the spring and they changed grades to pass fail. How do we explain that? That's a great, and that was actually one of my other points as to, what has changed in the pandemic times that I wanted to bring up, what's different for the applicant. And that's the transcripts and the GPA. And that's for 2020 graduates and now even, anybody who is currently in their senior year. So that'll include our 2021 grads who are, might be working remotely, et cetera, and having the pass fail. And so how do you talk about that? So, and especially for those students who had maybe a rough first year and then had an upward trend, and then all of a sudden they're now getting pass-fail grades. And so it's more difficult to improve the GPA and see that upward trend. And so how do you explain it? I think a GPA addendum is important in this instance. Admissions committees understand, because admissions committees are working in law schools, they also know that perhaps their institution or other institutions went to pass-fail, and so they know that students are in that. So but still, I think it's important that you acknowledge it and that you talk about it. So even in the instance where you aren't one of the people that I'm talking about that was looking forward to an increase in the GPA, I think it's important to acknowledge that the semester that you had to leave school in March and all of a sudden your grades went to pass fail, that you acknowledged that you were doing top level work. It was either maintaining the same GPA or you were on an upward trend. And so I think also one of the ways that you can help that is if you have a professor that you were working with perhaps in the semester that you're taking the pass-fail, that can speak to the quality of your work and your contributions in class. I think that would speak volumes as well for those that are unsure about how a pass-fail grade will look. Withdrawals on transcripts, Virginia, I'm not ignoring you. I'm going to go back to your question in a second. But withdrawals on transcripts and gap during senior year in college, writing a separate addendum, not necessarily. You can write a single addendum and incorporate both of those. They can be, it can be a transcript addendum, and you can talk both about the withdrawal and then talk about the gap on the same addendum, just hitting both themes. I think that's fine, and that's clear and concise. Keep them both very short to the point, and that explanation will work fine. Advice for splitters. Again, splitters are interesting. It's often, it depends upon the committee and the school as to which is weighted more heavily. I know, and this is my own kind of reader bias and my own committee bias. We all have our own personal biases. So my bias on splitters was I put a little bit more weight on the GPA than I would on the LSAT. So I always liked splitters who had higher GPAs, and then maybe not necessarily LSATs that were our target LSAT. That said, I think for someone that is 20 years out of school and looking to go back to law school, I think there's enough distance between you and your GPA that if you're a splitter in the other direction and that you have a higher LSAT and a lower GPA, I think the LSAT or the test score, if you're taking the GRE, I think that's going to hold a lot of weight. Because again, you're very different than who you were as an undergraduate. So again, it's a matter of how, I would again, if it's not explained well in the narrative of your personal statement, and when I say explained well, I'm not saying that your personal statement is going to be bad. I'm just saying if that's not a thread in your personal statement, then I would also suggest an addendum and just talk about your circumstances and, depending upon where the split is, what is higher, talk about how, I would like to be, held more accountable based on the more, whether it's the GPA or the LSAT, et cetera, et cetera. That was a little bit rambling, but I hope that was helpful, Virginia. I've got a question from Christopher about volunteer and extracurriculars outside of school. Are they frowned upon or looked upon as less favorable than anything that's happening on campus? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So if you have interests outside of your campus community that you're involved in, that's fantastic. Good for you. Keep up with that. There's no secret formula. We're not looking for cookie cutter opportunities. You're taking advantage of opportunities elsewhere, then good for you, and don't worry about the admissions committee in that respect. Okay. What role does your graduate GPA play in the admissions process? It plays an important role. So again, when we're thinking about the GPA, and what admissions committees are looking at. The admissions committee, when they're looking at applications, they're looking as best they can to level the playing field a bit amongst all the applicants, and all applicants are required to have undergraduate GPAs. So that is that's what we're weighing, or admissions committees are weighing each applicant based on. That said, the applicant that comes in with a graduate GPA, that's your most recent work. That's your most recent tale of who you are as a student in the classroom. And so that's important. Law school is a professional school, it's a graduate school. So that's a comparable kind of apples to, maybe what's pears, that's a closer comparison. And so I think that's, that's important. If the graduate is slightly lower than undergraduate, do they frown upon that? Not necessarily. Again, if that's the case, I might suggest an addendum. If there's a significant drop to your GPA, or if in looking at your graduate transcript, I see some real kind of what we call red flags, you might want to just talk about that in an addendum and acknowledge that. And try as best as you can to explain the situation. Okay. What's the lowest GPA okay. And the admissions committee, what's the lowest GPA that you've come across, and how did that play a role for that applicant? So I've seen some low GPAs. It's difficult. Again, it depends on the institution that you're applying to. It depends on, the median GPAs at the institution. If you have a GPA that you're worried about, I would look at institutions on their ABA reporting form and look at their 25th percentile. And that's a good indication of the admissibility of a GPA. And so, it's, again, as I was talking earlier in the presentation, admissions committees are looking to, assist students and deal from strength, and set students up for success. And so, unfortunately, with GPAs, it's, that's a telltale sign of how a student can perform on a day-to-day basis in the classroom. And so that's why it's a tool in the admissions process. And so, it's an important tool. And again, admissions committees don't necessarily want to set students up for failure in that respect. How would an admissions committee view a student who did exceptionally well GPA-wise during the COVID shutdown? Very favorably. So if you, did very well during a difficult time, that's certainly going to work in your favor. Any sort of, kind of triumph over adversity, will be viewed very well. A transcript question in the military. So attended 6 schools. Yep. So I'm sorry, I got silent as I was reading. So military, so that is something that admissions committees are familiar with their military applicants, in that your service does not mean that you're always in the same place. And so therefore you are attending multiple schools. Many of them are online institutions. And so that is understandable. Again, as I was talking about earlier in the presentation, you never necessarily want to have the admissions committee ask the question why and not have it answered in your voice. And so, Cora, to answer your question, admissions committees are going to be familiar with military service members are going to have multiple institutions and multiple transcripts. That said, it's always good for applicants to kind of, guide committees through their narrative. And so for you to acknowledge that in an addendum, just, a transcript addendum, and just, kind of tip the cap and say, I served in the military. I was stationed, in various places, or, however you want to describe it. And so that's why you have multiple transcripts, and totally fine and totally understandable. Another question about how does an admissions committee view unpaid and paid jobs on resumes? So some admissions committees are going to ask specifically for you to designate on your resume or on an employment history section how many hours a week you were in the job, whether the job was during an undergraduate semester, and whether the job was paid or unpaid. And so those are just questions that add context to what's happening. And, again, the context is generally to be used in the applicant's favor. So, when the question is asked, how many hours a week, and was it during your undergraduate semesters, that's, showing us that, your success as a student that semester was also impacted by the fact that you worked 20 hours a week in this, unpaid internship, or, 20 hours a week as a bar back in the local establishment. So those, it just adds context and information that might not otherwise be gleaned. Unpaid internships are hard work, and often they are, students have solicited those on their own, cold called or cold emailed. And so it's, the fact that you're devoting time to a job that you're not being paid for, that shows a bit of character as well. So, so all of those things, again, admissions committees are generally looking at what is in the favor of the applicant and add strength to the application, not trying to gotcha in any sort of way. So I also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what's going to be different on the law school side. So how did the pandemic impact law schools? How did the pandemic impact law school admissions office? And what does that mean? How is that important for you to know? So there's going to be enrollment fluctuations this fall. So we won't necessarily know what those fluctuations are until October 5th. And I say October 5th because October 5th is when law schools have to report data to the ABA and the LSAC. And that data includes enrollment numbers. So on October 5th, that is when, unless because of the pandemic, that's going to get moved around in some way, but as far as I know, it's October 5th. That's when we're going to know how the pandemic affected fall 2020 enrollment numbers. What does that mean for applicants for fall 2021? What's going to be important is what were the deferral rates for 2020 to 2021. So deferral rates are those applicants who were admitted and deposited for fall of 2020 who, given the uncertainty of what's happening and schools going back remote and them not wanting to spend their first year of law school remote, or them not wanting to move to another part of the country because of the pandemic and the uncertainty related to that, have asked for a deferral. And so admissions offices often handle deferrals on a case-by-case basis. Generally, they don't want to give out very many deferrals because that affects, again, their numbers of the current year. But given a pandemic, that might have been something that has changed and increased for schools this year. So that said, I would guess that on October 5th, we're going to find that some schools had lower enrollments this fall than they've had in the past. Lower enrollments lead to lower revenues, and many schools were hard hit last spring because when they were asking students to go home in March, they were then refunding for those institutions, both law schools and undergraduates. And for those law schools that are on undergraduate campuses, they don't exist in a vacuum. So there's shared revenue sources there. So housing is a big revenue for institutions. When they were sending students home in March, they were also refunding housing. And so that led to many losses. Also, many institutions host conventions, host events on their campuses that no longer happen. So that intended revenue wasn't there. So again, schools were hit by revenue in the spring. They're likely going to be hit again with lower tuition dollars this coming fall. And so what does that mean for fall 2021? It means a couple of things. It means there are going to be deferrals from fall 2020 to fall 2021. So some institutions are already going to have a percentage of their class complete. It's not necessarily going to be a high percentage. So please, I don't want you freaking out, okay? Don't freak out. I'm smiling. It's going to be okay. Because it also means that next fall, they might increase enrollments to make up for some of the revenue lost in this last year, this last academic year. So how is this going to impact you? What I'm going to ask you to do is just be a knowledgeable consumer. So what does that mean? That means on October 5th, every school is submitting numbers. They also have to report those numbers to the public. So on every school's website, they have ABA disclosures, and it has to be somewhere that's known on their website that's easily accessible. Have those tabs saved on your computers. So go to the schools that are your target schools and save their ABA required disclosures so that you have an understanding of what their enrollments look like. You can also, if you've got time and the wherewithal, you can also look at their fall 2019 enrollments versus their fall 2020 enrollments, and then likely make those projections out. So again, they have to have, at least I think it's 3 years of data on the website, on that page. So you'll have all of this at your fingertips. So be a knowledgeable consumer. Look at those enrollment numbers, look at the rate of change. And then again, call admissions offices, ask those questions, ask, how many spots are they looking to fill for fall 2021? They may not be specific in their, what they're telling you, but they'll give you the best information that they can give you. And so that's important. So you can ask, so you can do your own research. You can ask admissions offices about how many deferments were granted. And they may or may not tell you, but you can ask the question. And then ask about enrollment goals for fall 2021. Are they going to return to the previous class size? Are they going to go higher? And so that, again, you can be as informed as you can be. So another piece of that is what we can learn from the pandemic is on the institution side is how did the school respond to the pandemic? So it was new for everybody, right? I mean, nobody anticipated it happening. Nobody anticipated the global impact. Nobody anticipated that literally everything was going to shut down. And so how did the school respond? How schools respond in crisis is an indicator of the community. A community that is supportive in good times can be supportive in bad times, is likely to be supportive in bad times. Schools that struggle with cohesion on a good day will likely show that that's going to come clearly through on a bad day. So how can you get that information? Current student feedback, right? So I know on Boston University, they have a page, and many schools have pages on their websites that says, talk to a current student. And you can email a current student. Use that opportunity. Reach out to current students and talk to them about what's the climate on campus. How was it before the pandemic? How did the school respond? Did they feel supported in that response? Because again, that's going to shine through for those schools that have that good community and are supportive of their students. And you'll also get an understanding of that when you contact admissions committees and how you feel about how they respond to you. And so, again, be knowledgeable consumers, be informed consumers as that comes through. Let's see. So what else about the law schools and institutions, that's going to change and has changed? Your ability to visit it's changed, right? So you can't necessarily go and kick the tires and get a physical sense right now. Hopefully soon that will come to fruition, and hopefully they'll be back to spring admitted students days. But right now that's not the case. You can't go and do a fall visit and sit in a class. So what can you do? Oh, and the other piece of it is law schools aren't traveling to you. So, in the fall, that was the big recruiting season when representatives from law schools would come to fairs and visit colleges and do the national fairs. And so you could, shake hands and meet with them. There's no shaking hands anymore, but you're not even getting to meet with them. So I'm going to implore you to be more active in the process. And by that, I mean, again, getting on websites, getting availability of talking to current students, because, you can still email, you can still call, seek out webinars. Schools are being creative and they're trying to find ways. They're doing virtual tours, they're doing webinars, they're having information sessions like this. So again, be discerning consumers. Those schools that are doing these things and being more proactive and trying to convey the community as best they can, are going to be good at this and are going to show this and are going to have current students that are going to be involved in this. Again, because supported current students are going to have that balance to be able to reach out to incoming students and new students and talk, as opposed to, kind of clutching and hanging on to by a thread to keep themselves together. So you still can get a sense of community even in this virtual world that we're living in. So all right, questions. I know I've talked a lot about what institutions are doing. How to find current students aside from those the schools provide. And Facebook, LinkedIn, to get a more objective sense. I've never been one to send people to the forums, but you can use Facebook and LinkedIn and do that. So what specifically to ask them? Ask them questions, again, specifically about what their experiences have been. At Boston University, we asked our current students to be as honest as possible, and talk about the warts as much as you were talking about how great it was. And that's a good sense of the community. BU has a great community. BU supports their students very well. And so we felt confident saying current students, like, talk about the warts, talk about where you want to see improvement. But also, putting the onus on them. How are you also making those improvements? So what specifically to ask? Ask, where do you find support? How is the support? Are there availability of networking? Are you finding that you're in a silo, or are you finding that there's ways of you to meet 2Ls and 3Ls, as well as, alumni? How is that network? How are the student services on campus? And then again, during the pandemic, what happened? Where, did you feel like you were abandoned? Did you feel like you were supported? How did the faculty react? That's this, law school faculty are great, but they teach in a very specific way often and feed off of that live experience. And so for many of them, switching to a computer screen especially for the older law professors, that was different. So find out from the current students, how did the faculty adapt? How did that happen? Do they feel like the learning experience was a quality learning experience? How do you best prepare for the rigors of law school? Are there things that you can do to get ahead? So when I was asked that question, when I was on the admissions staff, I, half joking, would say, relax and read for pleasure as much as you can before law school, because your reading assignments are going to be given to you, for at least the next year, if not the next 3 years. You'll have a very specific reading list. But so best prepare for the rigor. Again, I would talk to current students, and as part of that conversation, ask those current students what they wish they knew before going to law school X. What they wish they had kind of in their repertoire before arriving, what they wish they had done. And you'll get some great insight from them. But again, there's no cookie cutter way of preparing for law school. Oftentimes, the orientation is where you're going to learn how to be a law student and, learn how to read in a specific way, learn how to write in a specific way. So, it's best to come in with an open mind and kind of a fresh perspective and a fresh start. So insight into the personal statement and sounding authentic without coming across as fake or fictitious. So again, thanks, Christopher, for the question. And the personal statement is, again, close to my heart, because when I was on the admissions committee, it was the first thing I read after reading the name of the applicant and where they were from, because I wanted to get a sense of who the person was and why they're applying to law school. So, so the best insight that I can give into the personal statement. First, I'm going to start with some advice, and that advice is 3 words: proofread, proofread, proofread. Make sure that your personal statement is proofread. So I, in my career, and that was 10 application cycles, read thousands of personal statements. And I read the majority of the personal statements were good to great. There were a percentage of personal statements that were not so good, and those were generally personal statements that were obviously not proofread. And anything that had, a proofreading mistake in the first paragraph was a pet peeve of mine. So make sure that you read your personal statement. Have a friend read your personal statement that doesn't necessarily have to have law school experience, but can be in tune to getting this perspective of you. And so how can you come across as sounding authentic and not fake? Well, don't write anything that's fake. Write your own story. Write why you want to go to law school. And it doesn't mean you necessarily have to have an aha moment. But, if you were having a conversation, if you and I, Christopher, were having the conversation right now, I'd ask why you want to go to law school. Cultivate that in your mind. Think about why you want to go to law school, and write some notes as you would be answering that question. And generally through those notes, you can come across a theme that you can write, 2 pages double spaced, that will be a good to great personal statement. Sound good? Other questions?
Well, Christine, this was a fantastic presentation. I feel like you hit all the major points, both the application in general, as well as how COVID is impacting everything. So a really comprehensive view of everything going on. We got a lot of great questions, a lot of great engagement in the chat. So thanks to everyone for asking such fantastic questions. And thanks to you, Christine, for addressing them so well. I really appreciate
my pleasure.
My
pleasure. Yeah, no, this was great. I mean, it's, there's nothing normal about the times that we're in, but there's going to be some consistencies in the application process. So hang on to those, and feel free to reach out to me at Accepted. It's christine.carr@accepted.com. If you have other more specific questions, we can certainly, talk those through.
Fantastic. All right. So I'm putting that email in the chat so everyone can follow up with you.
Great.
And
thanks
again, Christine. Really appreciate your taking the time. And I'll encourage folks to get in touch with you. And thanks again to everyone for asking such great questions.
Oh, thanks, everybody.
Totally. So have a good night, all. Of course, we have the group coaching mastermind coming up in just about 10 minutes. So folks, please join for that. And Christine will be in touch.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. Thanks again. Take care,
course,
everyone. Good night.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.